Hi, kiddos. Today we're going to be looking at how to analyze the rhetorical choices that an author makes. A rhetorical analysis is writing about writing. You're trying to show that you have figured out how the author has tried to manipulate his language. I say manipulate, which tends to have a bad connotation, but I don't necessarily mean it in a negative way. I say manipulate to emphasize that authors make conscious choices in an attempt to make their argument more clear or more convincing to their audience. The first step that you need to take before you start finding strategies is to find the author's purpose. If you've gone through Soapstone, you've already found it within the context of the rest of the piece. It should answer the question, what does the author want the audience to do or feel after hearing the piece? The next step is to find the devices or strategies that the author used in order to fulfill that purpose. The devices that you come up with will shape the body paragraphs of your paper. When you're in an AP language class, your teacher will most likely give you a list of rhetorical strategies to memorize. The list is long, so they'll most likely give you this at the beginning of the year, and you'll spend a few months memorizing what they are. When analyzing rhetoric, the rhetorical triangle is the first place to visit. Logos, pathos, and ethos are the big three. We'll talk in more detail about these in a minute, but you aren't limited to these. In fact, there are myriad devices that you can use when analyzing rhetoric. Repetition is something that many orators will use to emphasize ideas. Imagery can help an audience concretize an abstract concept. There are some esoteric terms like metonymy and anaphora, and the list goes on and on. But you do need to be careful. Now, a little advice before you start showing off your newfound vocabulary. Avoid getting hung up on terminology. While a broad device vocabulary is always helpful, you are unlikely to see esoteric terms like anaphora or synecdoche on the multiple choice section of the exam. As for the essays, if you cannot remember the term anaphora, simply using repetition will still get you the score you want as long as your analysis is strong. Okay, let's take a look at the big three. The rhetorical triangle is a theory that Aristotle came up with that posits the idea that there are three things all good arguments need: logos, pathos, and ethos. Now, before we begin, repeat after me. If I have Mrs. Chatty next year, I will not use the words logos, ethos, or pathos. They are rather unnatural, and your credibility as a writer often depends upon maintaining your own voice. So instead of saying that an author uses logos, which does indeed have an awkward sound to it, say that he or she uses logical appeal. Instead of pathos, they use emotional appeal. In lieu of ethos, you'll say that the author establishes his credibility. Let's talk about the triangle itself. If you think about the triangle, it's a shape of strength. For example, you cannot have a one or two-legged stool. It would fall down. But place a third leg on that stool and it can hold several times its weight. Similarly, in order to make a sound argument, one that can hold up to criticism or folly, one must have all three sides of the rhetorical triangle: logos, pathos, and ethos. Let's take a quick look at what each means. Logos deals with logic. Does the argument make sense to the audience that you are trying to persuade? Logical appeal deals with the text itself. Is it organized in a way that the audience can follow easily? Does the diction match the topic at hand? Syntactic structures will also help or hinder an argument. Short, simple sentences allow emphasis of ideas, but lengthy, complex sentences will allow for stating more complex ideas. Pathos deals with an emotional connection with the audience. Emotions can range from invoking fear to incite action, think Machiavelli, to sadness or empathy in order to move people to care about your ideas. Humor is often used to create a positive feeling toward the ideas the speaker is presenting. When you speak of pathos, you're looking at what emotions the speaker is trying to get his audience to feel in order to persuade them to do something. Ethos deals with credibility. Credibility can be attained through letting the audience know about an expertise that the speaker has. For example, during back to school night, I try to not so subtly drop the fact that I attended Columbia University to the parents. The fact that I went to an Ivy League university tends to impress the parents of my students. It encourages them to believe that I know what I'm doing, that their children's education is safe in my hands. You can also establish credibility through other means, though, showing that you've done your research and have looked for credible sources, for example. Even Aristotle knows that these three ideas don't reside in a vacuum, though. All arguments are given and taken within a context. Is there anything you know about what sparked the speaker to write the piece? Is there something you know about the historical context that would explain anything about the author's purpose? As we've seen, Soapstone will help you tackle this portion in the intro, but it will certainly frame the argument. As we've seen over and over in this country, the idea of taking away some of our freedoms in America will sometimes be met with absolute hostility, but sometimes met with a grudging understanding, depending upon the context of why those freedoms are in question. Let's take a look at an example. Each rhetorical analysis will have two parts to it, the introductory prompt and the text itself. This slide shows an example of the introductory prompt. This one is as closely plagiarized as I could make it to the wording of the rhetorical analysis prompt from the 2015 exam, but using Old Major's speech from Animal Farm instead of Cesar Chavez's article about nonviolence resistance. Let's take a look at what we see. You should do something similar when you're deconstructing any rhetorical analysis prompt. This part of the prompt gives you some context that usually ends up being useful for your rhetorical analysis. It will often give you some of the soapstone devices. For example, this one gives you the occasion, the speaker, and the audience. All of these will be useful in not only determining what to focus on in your analysis, but it can also help fill out your introductory paragraph quickly. Moving on, read the following such and such carefully. Then, in a well written essay, is something you'll see on every rhetorical analysis prompt. Sometimes they'll say a well developed essay, just to spice things up a little bit, but that's basically what you're going to see. Finally, you'll be presented with what they actually want you to write about. In this case, they want you to analyze the rhetorical choices that the author makes. It's usually phrased in this way, but can vary slightly. Analyze the rhetorical choices, analyze the choices the author makes, analyze how the author does something. All of them point to one thing, though. How does the author convey his purpose to his audience? Notice that this one comes close to giving you the purpose, rebellion. After just a short reading of the piece, you'll easily see that he wants the animals to rebel. The purpose is key in a rhetorical analysis. It's rare that the purpose will be difficult to decipher, and sometimes the prompt will straight up give it to you. Just make sure you're asking yourself, what does the author want his audience to do or feel after hearing this speech? All rhetorical choices that you discuss in this paper must all come back to this purpose. Of course, in order to figure out what the purpose is, and of course, what choices the author makes in order to achieve this purpose, you'll need to read the text itself. For the purposes of time, you should read this excerpt on your own if you haven't already. This is Old Major's speech from Chapter 1 of Animal Farm. Go ahead and pause this video and give yourself a few minutes to read through it while thinking about the choices Old Major makes in order to develop his argument about rebellion. Do that now if you haven't already. During your reading, hopefully you saw Old Major's purpose. Remember that the prompt told us to analyze the rhetorical choices Old Major makes to develop his argument about rebellion. That's here. Work night and day, body and soul, for the overthrow of the human race. That is my message to you, comrades. Rebellion. If you're having trouble finding the purpose, try asking yourself the question, what does the author want his audience to do or feel after experiencing this piece? In this case, the prompt has already told you that you need to focus on rebellion, plus the answer to that question is given to you in the speech. The author, Old Major, wants his audience, the other animals, to overthrow the human race, i.e., to rebel. Now that you know the purpose, the next step is to identify the choices that Old Major used in his speech. Now, this is where you want to be careful. The number of strategies that Old Major uses are endless. During your reading, you can easily see the repetition of the word comrades throughout the piece and the repetition of the phrase no animal in England in the second paragraph, which is also an example of negation and an example of anaphora. There's foreshadowing, personification, not to be confused with anthropomorphism, which is throughout the entire novel. He throws some alliteration in there. There are a bunch of rhetorical questions, some of which are actually hypophora. If you're focusing on simply identifying his rhetorical choices, pretty soon your annotations look like this, which is just too difficult to work with, especially in a timed right setting. What you want to focus on are the rhetorical choices that you can connect to Old Major's purpose to convince the animals to rebel. For example, the fact that the speech is told through a pig is indeed anthropomorphism, but that's going to be difficult to connect to Old Major's purpose since all of the animals are anthropomorphic in this novel. Anthropomorphism would be a good strategy when you're discussing George Orwell's purpose. Why would he use animals to tell this story? But that's not what we're working on here. Hopefully, you've also noticed that you are not writing an argument part paper here. You will not be writing whether or not the animals should rebel. You'll be focusing on how well Old Major convinced the animals to rebel through the choices he made with his writing. As I said before, too, you'll want to tend to stay away from esoteric terms like anaphora. Anaphora is a technique that is often used in many famous speeches, and it's a good technique. Any repetition creates an emphasis of the repeated words, and anaphora especially creates a cadence that good speakers and their listeners love. However, does the anaphora here, the repetition of no animal in England, connect easily to Old Major's purpose of inciting a rebellion? The answer is not really. Sure, you could stretch it a bit and say that the repetition of no animal in England will create an emotional impact on the animals. The fact that not one of them will know happiness and not one of them is free is maddening. However, you won't be able to say much more than that. Plus, the fact that there are so many other uses of emotional appeal throughout the speech, to focus on just that one so that you could show off your vocabulary is probably not the wisest choice. No, you'll want to focus on bigger ideas. Either look for strategies that the author uses so ubiquitously that they permeate the entire speech, or look for strategies that create a larger impact on the purpose of the speech. Looking at the rhetorical triangle can often lead you to bigger ideas, as will looking at any shifts in tone within the organization of the speech. Let me give you a couple of examples. I've color coded some ideas that I found: red for pathos, yellow for ethos, and blue for logos. Note that Old Major starts with an emotional appeal, with a small break to establish some credibility, moves on to logical appeal, then shifts to another, albeit different, emotional appeal. After using these appeals, he offers his solution. Now, this looks much less messy than when I was just identifying different rhetorical strategies, but this is still just identification. If we cannot connect these to Old Major's purpose, again, convincing the animals to rebel, then we do not have ourselves a rhetorical analysis. Let's take a look at what we have. He starts off with an emotional appeal. Whenever you discuss emotional appeal, be sure to state which emotion the author is attempting to evoke. In this case, he's talking about his imminent demise, so I imagine he's trying to evoke some sadness or pity from his audience. The next step, and the most important step in a rhetorical analysis, is to connect this strategy with his purpose. How is making his audience feeling sad about his impending death going to convince them to rebel? Well, if this is the last thing that he's going to say to us before he dies, it must be pretty important. This emotional pity makes his audience treat his ideas more seriously. Before moving to his main argument, He shifts to establishing his credibility. He establishes that he's lived a long life and has thought a lot about the animals' lives. Does this connect to his purpose? Sure. He knows a rebellion is a lot to ask of these animals who have lived in slavery all their lives. This establishment of credibility lets them know that they can trust him. He then moves on to another emotional appeal, this time furthering the negative emotion of sadness to absolute misery. He spends time describing the pervasiveness of the problem that the animals are facing. He begins with a rhetorical question, asking the animals what the nature of their lives are. Then he answers that question with diction that shows misery. He uses words like miserable, laborious, short lives, forced to work, last atom of strength, slaughtered, hideous cruelty. This is followed with the anaphora that I spoke of before, which I can use in the context of the bigger idea of the emotional appeal of misery. In this case, the repetition of no animal in England can be happy or free certainly does this. But we still aren't finished. Can we connect this emotional appeal to his purpose of convincing the animals to rebel? We can safely say yes to that as well. Here, the misery he wants his audience to feel is setting up the plain truth, as he states, that their lives are miserable. If he can convince them of their misery, he'll have an easier time to convince them of the need to rebel. Now he shifts to logical appeal. He uses simple syntax to make the cause of all the problems he just went through. It is summed up in a single word: man. Then he goes on to give specific details of how man has caused their misery. Man takes their food and steals their children. Old Major gives example after example for specific animals to prove this. How does this connect to the purpose of causing them to rebel? Old Major answers that. Remove man from the scene, in other words, rebel, and our lives will be better. He offers more logical appeal with more concrete examples of how the animals are productive, but man consumes without producing. Why would this convince them to rebel? They're taking all of our stuff. Overthrow him, and we get to keep what's rightfully ours. Then there's another shift, back to pathos. But instead of sadness and misery, Old Major focuses on examples and diction that would inspire fear and anger. He uses personification like cruel knife and phrases like scream your lives out. He doesn't hold back by describing the gruesome deaths of Boxer, whose throat will be cut and will be boiled down, and the dogs who will be drowned alive with a brick around their necks. In this Machiavellian moment, Old Major summons the power that fear would have on spurring action. If the animals are afraid for their lives, they can more easily be convinced to rebel. Finally, Old Major ends the speech with his solution. Again, it's shown simply. Note the syntactic structure of when he first introduces the idea of rebellion. That word is all by itself, emphasizing its simple importance. This will make it easier for the word to concretize into the minds of even the simplest of the animals. Old Major also lightens the tone of the piece here by repeating the word perfect, emphasizing the idealistic nature of his plan. This positive mood would help equate idealism with rebellion. Okay, that's it for analyzing the strategies. Now you're ready to construct a strong thesis for a rhetorical analysis and throw together the body paragraphs. We'll see you next time.